A concept is a reflected representation. The matter of all concepts is the object. The form of all concepts is universality. In the latter, there is abstraction from that by which the manifold is distinguished. Immanuel Kant. So far, I talked about the intellect in pretty general terms. I just said the intellect creates synthetic unity. It synthesizes the I by apperceiving all our representations as belonging to one subject. Through the power of imagination, it synthesizes our perceptions by apprehending all the various sensations as belonging to one perception. And now I said that it brings synthetic unity into the various perceptions, synthesizing them to one unified experience. Kant calls the intellect the faculty of rules, because that is what it does. It gives rules to things. That is how it synthesizes and unifies. Right? When I, to take up the previous example, when I say that the stone is hot because of the sun, I'm describing a rule. I'm saying the sun, as a rule, causes heat, warms up the things that it shines on. And here you should remember the two modes of cognition that Kant talks about. I described them already in a previous lecture, the one on what is philosophy to Kant. There I said that all our cognition, according to him, is either discursive, and that is exactly the cognition of the intellect, or it is intuitive, which is the cognition of sensuality, at least in human beings. That's how it is. It may be that in God the intellect is intuitive, but in us the intellect is discursive and sensuality is intuitive. And the thing is that the discursive cognition is cognition through concepts. And a concept is a general representation, Kant says. This discursive cognition is cognition through concepts. A concept, according to Kant, being a general representation, while an intuition, or as I say, a viewing, is a specific representation or a singular representation. So Kant also calls the intellect the faculty of concepts, but that is really the same as calling it the faculty of rules, because a concept is a rule. It is a general representation that is not singular, but rather is applied to many, many things, and that contains attributes which are true of all these things. So, for example, when I have the concept of gold, then this contains a rule that is true for all objects in the world which are gold, to which this concept applies. So I'm saying, as a rule, gold is shiny. As a rule, gold is a metal. As a rule, gold can conduct heat and electricity. As a rule, gold doesn't rust. So the concept is about what do I generally think when thinking of that object. Um, Kant likes to say that the intellect has cognition of little in many things, while the intuition or viewing has cognition of a lot in a few things. What he means by that is, well, let's take a dog. If you see a dog, you have cognition of very few things, of only that one specific dog, not all dogs in the world. But on the other hand, you have cognition of but on the other hand, you have cognition of a lot of things in that dog. Like you see the color of his fur, you see if he is how big he is, if it's a tall or a small dog. You can hear the way he barks and so on. On the other hand, if you just think dog, the concept of dog, you have cognition of many things, because this concept is applied to thousands to millions of dogs around the world. But in those many things, you only have cognition of very few things. Like you don't have cognition of the color, because the mere concept of dog doesn't include whether it's a black dog or a brown dog or a white dog or a gray dog. You don't have cognition of the height, like is it a big dog, is it a small dog. You only have cognition of very few things, like for example, a dog is an animal, a dog is a mammal, therefore it is born live and not coming from an egg. It is drinking milk from its mother when it's born. It generally has 4 legs. So you have cognition of very, very many objects, but only of very few things in those objects. And with viewing, it's the other way around. You have cognition of very few objects, but of many things in them. Kant also often says that through viewing, we get the object as it affects us, as it appears to us, and through the intellect and its concepts, its general rules, we think the object as it is. However, this is, the object as it is, must not be necessarily taken to mean as it is in itself. I talked about this difference in my lecture on Kant's transcendental idealism. And the thing in itself, we can't have any cognition of, because we can't view it. We don't have any empirical knowledge of it. We can think of it, but that is an empty thought. We can only think that it is not what appears to us. So we don't know anything about it. Here, when Kant says the intellect thinks the thing as it is, that maybe should be taken to refer more to the physical thing in itself. So, for example, when you see other human beings, in your viewing, you see them from the outside. You don't see them having organs, internal organs, like a brain or a heart or lungs. Or when you walk down the street, you only see the facades of the houses. You don't see if there's anything behind it, if there are rooms inside. But that is what you think. When you think of the concept of a human, like you think what is the rule that applies to all humans, that concept includes as some attributes having a brain, having a heart, having lungs. And likewise, when you think of the concept of a house, of a building, that also includes having an inside, having rooms. So you view the thing as it appears to you, as it affects you, and through a concept which is not a singular representation like the viewing, but rather a general representation applying to all objects which fall under that concept. Through the concept, you think the thing as it is. Now, all real cognition, understanding what something is, only happens through concepts. I like the German word better, by the way. The German word that Kant uses is Begriff. Now, Begriff, on the one hand, is related to the verb begreifen, which means to understand. So the concept is that through which we understand. The Begriff is that by which we begreifen. But begreifen itself comes from the verb greifen, which means to grasp, to take into your hand, to hold on to. So, this is also something you can say in English, right? To have a grasp of something, like literally with your mind, holding on to it, taking it in. That is what the Begriff, the concept, does. It allows you to take something into your mind and make it part of you, so to say, and understand it. Without the intellect providing its concepts, its rules, we could not have experience. Once again, saying that the stone is hot because of the sun means I apply my concept of causality, which is a rule, right? The concept causality means, as a rule, if something A is there, then by this A being there, something else, B, is also there. That is what, as a rule, causality means. Now, how exactly that works, what that A and that B is, that depends on the individual case. Like, it depends on the individual dog, whether he's brown or white or black. But in general, causality means if A is there, by virtue of A being there, something different from A, some B, is also there. And this rule, this concept of causality, which once again is one of the 12 concepts we don't take from experience, but take out of our own intellect, but about that I will talk in a future lecture, only by this concept of causality we can connect those perceptions and get to an experience that the sun heated up the stone. Without concepts, we could still have sensuality. And in fact, that's how Kant describes animals, having sensuality, having sensations and perceptions, but not having an intellect, and therefore having no concepts, no rules by which to understand their perceptions. Then our perceptions would be blind. That is a very famous statement of Kant's, to say that viewing, intuition without concepts is blind. We don't know what we see. Once again, I remind you of the example of the savage seeing a house without knowing what he sees, or of the archaeologist digging up some object, some artifact, without yet knowing what it is. But on the other hand, that's the other half of the famous quote by Kant, thoughts without content, and really thoughts here means concepts, like a thought basically is a concept to Kant. Thoughts without content, and that is of course sensual content, that is of course viewing, thoughts without content are empty. That is that is basically the great insight of Kant's critique of pure reason, to say that viewing, sensuality, and thinking, concepts, intellectuality, they must come together in order for us to have a cognition. Without the concepts, we would be blind. We would have a chaos of sensual data that we couldn't order. We couldn't bring into a form. We wouldn't understand what we are seeing and hearing and so on. But on the other hand, when we don't have sensual viewing, we can have concepts, meaning we can have rules of something. Like, I can think of things that I have never experienced. Like, I can think of angels, for example, and make a rule about angels. I can say they are spiritual beings that, as a rule, serve God and so on. Or I can think about aliens and say, as a rule, they are living beings that originate from other planets than Earth. But the thing is that this is an empty concept so long as I don't fill it with some sort of sensual viewing, with some sort of experience. I don't know if this rule I make up about how angels are, if there's any object out there in the world to which this rule applies. I mean, the rule as such is fine. Maybe it doesn't contradict itself, but that's not enough to prove its reality. I can make up all sorts of things. I can come up with a whole fantasy world with fantastical creatures, or with a magic system with its own eternal rules and laws of how the magic works. But those are just empty concepts. They are just subjective. They are just in me. They are made up by me. And I don't know if there's a real object related to that concept, unless I have viewing, unless I have empirical data to, so to say, fill that concept with. That's the great insight of the critique of pure reason. And that will also lead Kant to concluding that when you do metaphysics, it can be immanent. I talked about this in my lecture on what is metaphysics, and there I explained the difference between immanent and transcendent. So it can be immanent. You can do metaphysics of nature, so you can, with pure reason, think about objects in the world, objects that you can experience. You can know certain things about those objects without having experienced them, simply through reasoning. But metaphysics cannot be transcendent, so you cannot simply by reasoning and without any experience know something about an object which can't ever be experienced altogether, like God. That doesn't work. But more on that in a later lecture when I come to the dialectics of pure reason. For now, it is only important to understand that this constitutes the third, so to say, the third step in the process of experience, the third type of synthesis that we do. The intellect creates a synthesis of the subject, that is a perception. The intellect directs the power of imagination in creating a synthesis of the object, that is apprehension. And now finally, in intellection, the intellect creates a synthesis of the subject's representation and the object being represented. Now, it is very important to understand that a concept of a thing, or to more directly translate the German Begriff, the grasp we have of a thing is not the same as the word for a thing. The word is more like a sign pointing towards that concept, making us think of that concept. Can be a vocal sign in speaking, can be a visual sign in writing, or a hand sign. But the word is not itself the concept. So the same concept can be expressed in different words when you have synonyms, right? The concept of asking something or questioning something, inquiring something, those are different words that generally describe the same concept. Or like if you have words like wrath and ire and anger, they may be different words, but they generally seem to refer to the same concept. Of course, on the other hand, you can also have homonyms. That means that you have one and the same word making the same sound, but it is referring to completely different concepts. Like a band can refer to the concept of a group of people, maybe playing music together, or it can refer to the concept of a sort of ring, or like a hairband or whatever. And even between different languages, you have, of course, a difference in vocabulary, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the difference of concepts. Like, it doesn't really matter if I say water or Wasser or aqua or agua or su, because those are just different ways of referring to the same concept. If you know the English language, you will think the same when hearing the word water as someone who knows the German language when hearing the word Wasser, or someone who knows the Turkish language when hearing the word su. It's not like to you water is different things. It's not like speakers of different languages think of different things when thinking of water. They just call it by different names. Now, of course, that's not to say that all languages share the exact same concepts. There are certain concepts that maybe one group of people has, and therefore they have a word, a name for it, and others don't. That often is a reason to take up a word from another language. When you get that concept, when it gets introduced to you by another people, by another culture, then you may, instead of making up your own new word, take their word. So take, for example, the word philosophy. Surely there was a concept of wisdom amongst many peoples. Therefore, they maybe had a word for wisdom because they all had wise people. They all had sages, maybe. But there was no concept of philosophy as such, of this systematic scientific endeavor towards wisdom. That was something specifically Greek. And that is why when other peoples adopted it from the Greeks, they also had no word for it, because it was a new concept and they took up the Greek word. The Greek philosophia became philosophy or philosophy or falsafe or whatever various groups in Europe or in the Arabic world ended up calling it. Many misunderstandings just come from the fact that different people may use the same word but refer to different concepts. So, to give a simple example, I believe in UFOs. That's not just me saying that for the example. I'm actually serious about it. I do believe in UFOs. And if you now think, is he crazy? Then you probably believe the same thing as me. Um, because I don't believe that aliens are visiting us in spaceships and flying saucers. Um, but that's not what UFO means, right? It means unidentified flying object. And I think no one is gonna deny that those exist. Like, maybe it's just a bird or a weather balloon in the end, but surely there sometimes are objects flying across the sky that we can't identify and that vanish before we have identified them. Um, so the thing is that when I say I believe in UFOs and another person says that he doesn't believe in them, um, in words we may disagree, but it is very much possible that in concepts we do agree. We just apply different words to the concept. As a side note, I think it is very important to try and be clear and precise in our language, because the language is that through which we think. So a person who wants to be clear and precise and distinct in his thinking, a person who wants to be aufklärt, should strive for using language clearly, and that is why it is a shame that our age is so mindless with language usually, and we are thereby destroying our language. Now there's sometimes talk about the language being destroyed and language getting worse and worse because people speak it less and less well. And then on the other hand, you have people arguing against that, say, with positivist arguments, saying no, all language is equally good or bad. Language cannot get worse; it can only change. New words come up, old words get lost, the grammar changes. What was slang at one point becomes the normal way of speaking at another point, but that's not necessarily worse or better, it's just different. Um, well, I have a different position from both. In the spirit of Kant's sympathetic method, which seeks the truth in both positions and combines them both, I believe a language can get better or worse, and we should therefore strive to make it better and not worse. But I don't base that on arbitrary aesthetic notions or on just taking the way the language is spoken now or was spoken just yesterday and now saying it must not change anymore from here on, but rather I base that on how well you can think and express your thoughts in that language. And that is why when we have different words that could refer to different concepts, we should not confuse them with one another. Like a spaceship, the concept of a spaceship, why would you call it an UFO? You have a word for it. You can call it a spaceship or a flying saucer if you want. You don't need to apply the word UFO to it. It can only be applied as long as it's unidentified. As soon as you identified it as a spaceship, it's not a UFO anymore by definition. Because ultimately, that is making the language more poor. And that is making being precise and clear in that language more difficult. Because the word UFO already means a thing. It already means unidentified flying object. And now when I use it, uh, there's some unclarity about how it is meant. And now I have no word left to describe an unidentified flying object, at least no word that isn't ambiguous. And therefore, if you have a word for a concept, use it. Don't abuse another word that belongs to another concept. I don't see any reason why, for example, you would call a brave person courageous. A brave person who fights his fear and who does something despite of his fear is not a courageous person. Because to have courage means to have no fear. If you have courage, you don't need to be brave. You don't need to overcome your fear if you simply don't have it. That is an important distinction. And it gets lost if we just turn these two words into synonyms and use them mindlessly without thinking about their difference. Or likewise, I see no justification to use the word self-conscious to describe someone who is shy. Like, that is just not what the word self-conscious means, right? You just use it mindlessly like that because everyone around you uses it like that, and you maybe never questioned that, never reflected on it. But if you think about it, being self-conscious simply means being conscious of yourself. It doesn't mean being shy, being unsure about yourself, being uncertain, being easily embarrassed. No, it means being conscious of yourself. And as a side note, the funny thing is that here in Germany, our word for self-conscious, selbstbewusst, which literally means the same, we also misuse it, but in the exactly opposite way. So in German, selbstbewusst is used to mean confident, while in English, selbstbewusst, that is self-conscious, is used to mean the opposite of confident, shy. It is neither, however. And we both have other words for that. German has other words for confident. We don't need to call someone confident self-conscious. And likewise, English has other words for shy or for uncertain. We don't need to call someone who is like that self-conscious. All this does is take the actual meaning of self-conscious away and make it difficult to talk about this concept because there is no good word for it left. And now if I use the word self-conscious for it, it causes misunderstandings. It causes unwanted associations. So by this, we are destroying our language. That is why you should reflect about your language. You should be mindful of what words actually mean or what they should mean and how you use them. And unfortunately, I may not be the best example when speaking here in English because English is not my first language. I understand it well enough. I can speak it to express myself, although I may struggle at times. But I don't have that mastery over it that I can really be too sure about how to use words and maybe not using them in the way they are usually used by the common speaker, but using them in a better and more precise way. I'm more mindful of my speaking in German. So maybe I'm not giving the best example here, but everyone can try that at least in his own first language, where he probably is the most sure, the most certain, the most secure. And at least there you can try and be mindful of how you speak, and thereby uh, cultivate your language. Don't just use it the way it's thrown onto you by the other speakers, but cultivate it into something that can really be used to express yourself, to sink in, and to express those thoughts. Unfortunately, we live in an age of irresponsibility. No one wants to take responsibility for anything, and so no one really wants to take responsibility for his language. I mean, on the one hand, we have the right wingers, whose whole politics is about nothing but open irresponsibility, not wanting to take responsibility for refugees and purer parts of the earth, not wanting to take responsibility for COVID and people who might easily get sick, not wanting to take responsibility for the climate crisis. Of course, they won't ever take responsibility for the language. They are not patriots, no matter what they claim. They are the exact opposites of patriots. I mean, this is just another example of how language is misused. A patriot is not the same as a nationalist. It's also not a less extreme form of nationalism. It's something completely different. And they don't have the patriotism to care for their own language and to cultivate their own language. But then on the other hand, you have the left, and it may seem like they are about responsible use of language, like they tell people to avoid certain words, certain expressions. But then this is not about active cultivation of the language. I mean, in total, they don't care about language as such at all. They use it as mindlessly as everyone else. What they care about is people's sensitivities, not stepping on anyone's toes. So they introduce some rules of conduct into the language. They tell you to avoid certain words because they are offensive and cause bad sensitivities. But that's all. Apart from that, they too don't want to take responsibility for the language. And we should be very careful to not let our language become more primitive, more simple, more undifferentiated, but rather the opposite, to cultivate them into becoming ever more clear. But anyways, back to the concepts. We also should note that even when two people use the same word to refer to the same thing, they still probably don't have the exact same concept of that thing. Of course, when I use the word water, everyone probably means roughly the same thing when saying water. But my concept of water is different from a child's concept or from a person's concept who lived some 100 years ago. Because a child or a person, say in the Middle Ages, probably when thinking water also thinks of something that is fluid, that you can drink, that can turn to ice when it's cold. But maybe they don't know that water can conduct electricity. Maybe the child doesn't know yet that it's not so good to stick wet fingers into the plug in the wall. Or also maybe they don't know yet that water is a molecule made up of hydrogen and oxygen, having the formula H2O. So our concepts overlap, but they are not exactly the same. And the thing is, no concept, at least no empirical concept, can ever be complete. Kant says when we make up a concept, like if I imagine a fantasy creature that I make up, then of course that concept can be complete insofar as it can't include something that I didn't make up yet. But when it comes to the concept of an empirical thing, there is always more we can learn. Like, we know more about water now than we did some centuries ago. But even so, that's not to say that water doesn't still have some attributes, be it at the subatomic level, that we don't know about. We can always know more. I probably have a more complete concept of Immanuel Kant than you do, having read all 29 volumes of his works. Yet still, there's so much about Kant which I don't know, of course, having not known him personally, having not spoken to him, having not read things of him, letters or school works that he may have written as a boy, that are lost now. So the concepts, they are never complete. We can always work on getting a more complete concept of something. And we should always be mindful when talking to someone else that there are probably no two people who have the exact same concept of the same object. There will probably always be some difference in what they think of when thinking of the same object. This also can lead to many misunderstandings. The fact I and another person I'm talking to may have overlapping but still in the end different concepts. Like, for example, once again, let's take racism. Often nowadays, when you tell someone that he's racist, he will get offended. Like, here in the public discourse in Germany for years, the right-wingers have repeated, oh, there's no freedom of speech, you can't say anything without immediately being put on the right, without immediately being called a racist. And the thing is that this feeling offended, it's not fake. I mean, maybe in a few cases it is. Surely in some right-wing parties there are some actual Nazis who maybe don't admit publicly that they are racists, and therefore may act offended when they are called racists, but who are racists. But in general, nowadays, most people who act offended when being called racist, they really are offended because they really think they aren't racist, but that is because they have a different concept of what a racist is than me, who calls them a racist. Like, they probably think a racist is someone subscribing to biological theory of different races, like was popular in the 19th century and early 20th century and with the Nazis. And he probably thinks, well, I don't subscribe to such a race theory. I don't believe that there are biologically vastly different races who may be subhuman, and therefore I'm not a racist. But I mean, we came further than that. In the sciences of spirit, in the so-called humanities, there are more complex and more differentiated concepts of what racism is. In my own terminology, I would say racism is less about a theory, a doctrine that you believe in, and it is more about a posture, a way you are and behave towards other people who may look different or come from different places or whatever. Or likewise, this is a big issue whenever religion is discussed, because different people have such different concepts of what religion or what God is, and therefore they're often not really talking with each other, even if they think they are, but rather with straw men. Like often when I talk to atheists, I had to conclude, well, yeah, this guy is completely right. This God that he is talking about, that's just a stupid fairy tale. But the thing is, often you find, especially with the aggressive atheists, like these new atheist types, the God that they attack, no serious person ever believed in that God in the history of humanity. Maybe some children and some fundamentalists believe in that God. Maybe therefore his arguments can attack their belief. But for the most part, you must not think of God as some dude with a beard sitting on a cloud and giving arbitrary rules saying, oh, if you don't pray or if you are gay, then I will throw you into hell or whatever. And the thing is, I have yet to meet one single atheist in my life who understands the concept of God that someone like Meister Eckhart or Ibn Arabi or Fichte had. And therefore, the God that this atheist may deny would also have been denied by these great thinkers. But the God that they confessed is a God that the atheist can't deny because he simply doesn't know about him. He doesn't understand him. And I mean, if you don't have a concept, if you haven't understood, if you haven't grasped a concept, then you can't judge if there's any reality to the concept or not. And now you can find that often when people have wrong opinions or when they act in the wrong way, when they do wrong things, this is because of their concepts. You can find that actually there may be some consistency, and actually they are not wrong if you assume the same concepts that they have. I mean, you can't say that any action as such makes sense or doesn't make sense. To get into a car and to put your foot onto the pedal, that makes sense if you assume that the car is working and you can drive it. But if you have another concept of that car, if you know that that car broke down and can't drive anymore, then of course that action doesn't make sense. But you can't just see someone getting into a car that you know broke down and can't drive anymore and trying to start that car and say, oh, what an idiot. Because if that person has a different concept of the car, if that person's concept of the car includes the car working because he doesn't know yet that it broke down, then of course he's not being an idiot, because his action makes sense based on what he believes. So if you want to change his action, you would have to change his belief. You would have to give him another concept. You would have to tell him that the car has broken down. And this is something we can observe all the time in the world. Like, even terrible actions make sense if they are based on terrible concepts. Like the Nazis killing the Jews, committing genocide, was consistent within their ideology. If the Jews are subhumans, if they are parasites, destroying the German people's body, then it makes sense to exterminate them like parasites. Now, of course, this whole concept of certain groups of humans being racially inferior and being subhumans, That is what is terrible. But the rest of it, the actions of the Nazis, are basically just the logical conclusion of that concept. That is also why we should be so mindful and so alert when people have dangerous and wrong and harmful concepts. Because even if that specific person, like if he, for example, has racist concepts, even if that person doesn't draw the conclusions that those people he thinks are bad, that they should all be killed, if his concept spreads, someone else may come to that conclusion and may not even be wrong in coming to that conclusion. May be wrong in concluding at all from this concept, but not wrong in the conclusion he draws. That is the danger. Even people you may think are crazy or wrong may not be based on their concepts. Like people who I don't know, in the early 2000s, fundamentalists in America who protested Harry Potter being available in school libraries because they believed that it turned their children towards dark magic and towards summoning demons. Of course, to anyone who has a little bit of reason, those people are nuts. And dangerous nuts and evil nuts. But the thing is, if you actually believe what they believe, if you believe that dark magic is real and that demons are real and that demon possession or hell is a real danger for your child, then maybe it makes sense to want such a book banned. And here the issue is that unaufkläred people, since they can't think for themselves, they are less intellectual and more sensual. So they use their intellect, the faculty of concepts, the faculty of rules, less, or at least they don't use it independently. They let it be guided by their sensuality. So something falls into their senses, into their eyes or whatever, that makes a big impression. And then they will be guided by that and base their judgments on that. And they will have a hard time thinking in general rules. So, for example, I had a conversation with my grandma a while ago about Alan Turing. She had somewhere heard the story of Alan Turing, the mathematician who in the Second World War, the British mathematician who helped the British get behind the codes the Nazis were using, and thereby contributed a lot to the Allies winning the war against the Nazis. But a few years after the war, because it became known that he was gay, and because that was still forbidden back then in Britain, he was forcibly chemically castrated, and that caused him to become depressed and shortly after commit suicide. And my grandma was very angry about that, and was going on how the UK had mistreated him, and she was saying, how could they do this? He was a war hero. He did so much for his country, and that's how they treated him. And I tried to explain to her that what they did was right based on their laws. Like, it was, back then, it was illegal to be gay. And a chemical castration to not spread the gayness was the punishment, or was the legal consequence of that. And it was right that he was not exempt from law, that he was not above the law, simply because he was a war hero, simply because he helped his country. I told her, would you speak in the same manner um, if he had been punished for something else, which we today still think should be punished? Like, let's say he had committed a murder and had been imprisoned for that. Would you then say, oh, how could they imprison him for murder? It may be illegal, but come on, he did so much for his country. He's a hero. He should be exempt from the law. No, in a state of rights, in a just state, the law applies to everyone equally. There are no exceptions. There are no people that are above the law because they are important, because they are heroes. So that's the right way to deal with someone. Now, of course, the law itself was a terrible crime. The law itself was against human rights, and that is what was wrong in this case. But if a law is in place, I want it to be applied to everyone equally. So in this case, the UK was not a formally unjust state, quite the opposite. Formally, this is very just to not exempt anyone, but rather it was a material unjust state. So the content of the law itself was unjust. And that, of course, was terrible. And that, of course, should have been changed and luckily has been changed since then. But unaufkläred people often have a hard time thinking like that. When something falls into their senses, like they just hear the story of how terribly he was treated, and of course that is terrible, but then that controls their whole judgment, and they can't abstract from their feelings, and without these sensual distractions, think about this in general abstract rules. So really, you must not lament or get angry so much at people's conclusions or at people's actions. Rather, their concepts need to be changed, and maybe also your own. The thing is that most people, they live in a fantasy world. They don't really live in the real world. Because they have all sorts of completely wrong concepts. Like, there are things that I would say 99% of the population is completely and utterly wrong about. Take certain things in history. Often we have completely wrong concepts of past times. Like, take the concept of the Middle Ages. If your concept of the Middle Ages is informed by movies or by average documentaries, which are terrible, absolutely terrible and worthless, then when thinking of the Middle Ages, you will probably think of dirt everywhere, dirty, muddy streets. No, they cleaned their streets. I mean, why should they have wanted to live in the dirt? Or you will think of knights in plate armor, when in fact that armor only came into use at the end of the Middle Ages, in like the Renaissance period. Or you will think of witch hunts and witch burnings, which again is something that started after the Middle Ages. I mean, in the time of the Reformation, when there was this divide between different sects, Catholics and Protestants and all kinds of Protestants, and everyone was accusing each other of heresy. That is when this witch hysteria really started, and the witches were burned in the 16th or especially in the 17th century, so long after the Middle Ages had ended. But in the Middle Ages, there was no big widespread belief in witches causing trouble, and there were no big witch burnings, and so on and so on. So in the case of most people, pretty much everything they believe about the Middle Ages or believe to know about the Middle Ages is completely wrong. meaning they live once again in a fantasy world. I mean, they believe that a past happened which never happened, and they maybe draw certain conclusions from that, which therefore must be wrong. For example, maybe they conclude that our time is in every way better than the past, and that the past was so terrible, when in fact the Middle Ages weren't so terrible. I mean, I don't want to romanticize them. There certainly were many terrible aspects, but there are terrible aspects about our time too. We would have to differentiate what was maybe terrible, what was maybe good. Um, and here, what is needed is self-reflection. That is why I often say that Aufklärung is based on self-criticism, on self-reflection. Because, of course, you can't have correct concepts about everything. And as I said previously, your concepts can't be complete anyways. I mean, even a historian who deals with the Middle Ages all his life won't know everything about the Middle Ages. And of course, I will always have lots of things that I have no clear concept of. Like maybe there's some bird in the rainforest that I don't know about. I don't know what that species of bird eats, how exactly they reproduce, how they find mates. I don't know that. But the thing is, there's one thing you can always know, and that is what you don't know. I mean, you just have to reflect and stop and think, wait, uh, do I know anything about this object? And do I really know anything about that object? I mean, the things I think I know, do I really know them, or have I just heard them somewhere, but not from a reliable source? And that is something that, of course, people rarely do. Like, you have people, right wingers, racists, who will love to tell you how evil Islam is, but actually they have no clue about what Islam really is. Um, if you ask them about Islam, I mean, maybe they can tell you, okay, there was this Prophet Muhammad, and they have this holy book, the Quran, and they don't eat pork. So, and that's where it ends. Um, and if that person would self-reflect, he could realize that that's where it ends. I mean, he would have to know that he's not an expert on Islam. He would have to know, wait, I never read the Quran. I don't actually have any clue what really is written in that book. Or he could know, wait, I actually don't know what's the difference between Sunnis and Shias and Ibadites. I haven't even heard of Ibadites. Or he could know, wait, I actually don't know what the Sunnah is. I actually don't know what fiqh is. I have no clue about anything when it comes to Islam, and therefore I'm not allowed to make a judgment, because all my judgments are unqualified, meaning if I do make a judgment, since it's not based on real data, it can only be based on prejudice. When it comes to something like the climate crisis, here in Germany, I mean, now we have just stopped talking about it altogether. The climate crisis is apparently over. The media doesn't talk about it. There are no public debates about it. Politicians don't talk about it, including the Green Party. They don't care about the climate at all. They are just named the Green Party for some reason. Maybe they like the color. But a while ago, there was still some talk. Well, not really about the climate crisis. In fact, there was never a point where the public talked about the climate crisis, but there was a talk about climate activists. And when there were, I mean, it started when there was Fridays for Future, when there were students skipping school. And then in more recent times, you had people gluing themselves to the street, stopping traffic. And there was a lot of anger about them. And often you hear climate activists being accused of being alarmist, of overreacting. Or you also even heard them being accused of being terrorists. Like, it's not like they harmed anyone, like they killed anyone, like they are going amok or blowing themselves up. But still, there were actually people and politicians talking about climate terrorists just because some guys glued themselves to the street. And or saying they are totalitarian, that they are enemies of democracy because they want to force the public and the government to go along with their demands. Now, all of these judgments come from people who have no clue about the climate crisis. And I mean, it's one thing to not know about the climate crisis, but it's another thing to not know that you don't know about the climate crisis. That means that you are deeply unaufklärt and that you have never self-reflected. Because if you did, you could realize, wait, I actually never bothered to learn about the climate crisis. I haven't listened to lectures by climate researchers or read books. I mean, there's a climate book, but clearly I haven't read it. Or I don't know anything about it. I don't know what the albedo effect is. I don't know what tipping points are. I don't know what the Keeling curve is. I have no clue about any such things. The fact of the matter is that the average person, when they hear climate crisis, their concept of climate crisis is, oh yeah, okay, I've heard that because of our emissions, it's going to get a bit warmer. Okay. Maybe that's gonna cause some problems. Maybe we should do a bit about it. Okay, and that's it. And so, of course, based on their concept of climate crisis, they are right. Based on that concept, climate activists are overreacting and being alarmist. But then again, based on and being alarmist and frankly just acting like crazy people. Like, when I say that the climate crisis is not simply the most important political topic of our age, of our century, but rather it is the only political topic that matters at all. Like all that other bullshit that talk about immigration or even talking about things that in theory do matter, like healthcare or I don't know, all of that pales in the face of the climate crisis. Talking about anything except the climate and arguing about any political matter except the climate is like sitting in a house that is burning and arguing about what to watch on TV today. When I say that, I'm well aware that most people will think I'm crazy. Most people will think I'm overreacting, and they are right based on their concept of climate crisis. But the thing is, they should realize that based on another concept of the climate crisis, so if you don't think, oh, okay, climate crisis means it gets a little warmer, but if you think climate crisis means our whole civilization breaks down and billions of people are displaced or dying, then the other people, the people who don't take it that seriously, the people who actually care more about immigration or whatever other unimportant political topic, they suddenly appear to be the crazy people. Again, they seem to be the ones who sit in a burning house and argue about what to watch on TV. So you have to realize, once again, that no action as such is crazy. It depends on your concepts. The same action that very much is crazy when the house is not burning makes a lot of sense when the house does burn. And the same behavior that is perfectly normal in a non-burning house becomes crazy in a burning house. So really the question is the house burning or not? And that is a question that clearly must be answered with yes, it is burning. And that is what all the climate research shows. And if I don't know about that research, then I could at least be aware of the fact that I don't know. And therefore, it is not my place to say that it isn't so. And that anyone who takes the climate crisis as seriously as it is just being alarmist. So, because if you have a real concept of the climate crisis as it is, then suddenly it does make sense to be radical about it, to take radical action. And in fact, in that case, gluing yourself to the street and disturbing traffic a bit is really nothing. To be quite honest with you, I'm actually surprised we don't have actual climate terrorists yet. I'm not saying we should have that. I don't want anyone to think that I would condone such a thing. No, that would be terrible. I hope it won't happen. But it wouldn't surprise me. It rather surprises me that it hasn't happened yet. That no one has yet become so desperate and so angry with this society just deciding to run into an abyss at full speed that they think the only solution is blowing things up. I mean, most people, they don't even know what a carbon budget is. And they certainly don't know how long our remaining carbon budget will last for. It's about 3 years maybe, if at all. And you can always test people like that. Like if they have an opinion about something, if they have a strong opinion about something, ask them such simple questions. And if they can't answer them, how dare they have an opinion? You have no right to an opinion on something you don't know about. An opinion should not be based on ignorance and prejudice and feelings. It should be based on actual knowledge. And if people, for example, had actual knowledge about the climate crisis, they wouldn't think that climate activists are being totalitarian or anti-democratic, because they would realize that the moment we don't have food anymore, we also won't have a democracy anymore. And I mean, we already lost about 80% of our insects. I mean, there's data about that, but even without data, you can just realize that. If you aren't too young, you will probably remember that in the past, if you rode in a car, there were a bunch of insects glued to your window when you stopped. But now they are gone. And already we see that the harvest rates are going down because there's a lack of insects. So if the other remaining 20% of insects are gone, I want all these people who now talk about climate activists being anti-democratic, I want to see how well their democracy will still function. But here the point is to get back to the concepts. The point is that when you talk to somebody, when you judge their opinions, their conclusions, their actions, you must understand their concepts. It is easy to just dismiss others and just say, oh, these people, they are acting crazy, or they are being stupid. But that is only if you imply that they have your concepts. They probably have their own concepts, and based on those, their actions probably make perfect sense. Now, their concepts might still be wrong, but you first must understand what concepts they have. And this becomes especially important when it comes to philosophy, because a philosopher usually has completely different concepts from the average person. They will turn, if you actually let them, they will turn your world completely upside down. But you must first realize this. Often it is not realized. Often people when talking to someone or when reading someone, they hear certain words and they will not ask, what concept does this person mean when using that word? But rather they ask, what concept would I mean when using that word? So let's take, for example, Nietzsche. Nietzsche criticizes morality, right? So he's anti-morality. He hates morality. He advocates for being evil, right? No. Yes, he is criticizing morality, but the thing is, he uses this word morality for a certain conception of morality. And there's another concept of morality, which Fichte would call higher morality, which Nietzsche doesn't criticize, but rather which is very close to what Nietzsche himself supports. Only he doesn't call that morality. So you can't just read the word morality in Nietzsche and read what he says about it and then think that now you know Nietzsche. Rather, you first have to understand what he means by this word morality, what his concept of morality is. And a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of disagreement, a lot of getting angry at others' positions and actions, or a lot of ridiculing others' positions and actions, is just based on hearing their words, but not understanding what concepts they mean by their words, rather hearing your own concepts in their words, but then of course finding your concepts that you have put in, well, into a new order, into a new system, in which they indeed make no sense, in which they indeed end up contradicting each other. But if you don't assume that these people share your concept, if you assume that by using the same words they mean different concepts, then maybe that system they have, which would not work if it was done with your concepts, maybe with their concepts it does work. Maybe trying to start a car that according to your concept has broken down is indeed a stupid action, but if their concept of that car is that it works, then maybe it is not a stupid action. And I mean, this brings me back to Kant's critical method that I talked about in an earlier lecture. You must not simply dismiss another position as wrong or as stupid or as ridiculous. Even if it is in the end wrong, it should not be enough for you to just say it's wrong and to just disprove it with counter arguments. You should ask yourself, if it is wrong, if it is so obviously stupid, how come it seems right to that other person? And for that, you need to first assume their perspective, get into their mind, understand their concepts, so to say. And maybe you will then find that, in fact, they aren't wrong, they are right. Now, if you ask, how is it that so often a concept is sort of confused with a mere word, and people don't make a better distinction between them, maybe that is once again because of that victim posture of unaufkläred people, because of them always thinking themselves passive. They seem to think that their concepts are not something that they made with their intellect. They are not based on a judgment, which may or may not be true, but rather they seem to think that their concepts immediately come from their perceptions. Like they perceive something and they have a concept immediately of what they perceived. A concept that is neutral, that is just a reflection of the perceived thing, that is just a fact. And then the word is just the name for that concept. People often think that their concepts are set and that they couldn't possibly be otherwise. that is also why they have such a hard time really thinking history. Like unaufklärt people, they are very much oriented on being, because of course being is that which you perceive, which your senses give you. Aufklärt people, they know there is such a thing as becoming, as change, as movement. But for unaufklärt people, there's only being. So they imagine the past as in the end being the same as the present. But maybe the most important discovery in the history of thinking in the last century is exactly how fluid our concepts are, how our concepts have a history. That is maybe the main insight of last century thinking. An insight already started in the previous century by Nietzsche, and then culminating at the end of the last century with someone like Foucault, who realized that many things that we take for granted, like, for example, Foucault explored the history of sexuality and the concept of sexuality and of sex. Many things that we take for granted, they were made, and often made fairly recently. Like sex as we know it, it's a concept of the 19th century at best. Before that, there was no concept of sex. Like, of course, people were sleeping with each other and deriving pleasure from that and conceiving children through that. But they didn't think of it as having sex, which is evidenced by the fact that they didn't call it that. I mean, the word originally doesn't mean sex in the sense of sleeping with one another, in the sense of sexual intercourse. Originally, in the Latin, it just means sex in the biological sense, being male or female. And only at the end of the 19th century did this word sex come about. And often, when a new word comes about, there is an indication for a new concept having come about, which wasn't there before. And that is why it's so anachronistic and ahistorical to talk about sexuality in past centuries, to say that this or that historical figure, for example, was homosexual. There were no homosexuals in the past. That was just not a thing. Now, maybe this historical figure preferred sleeping with men to sleeping with women. Sure. But he didn't think of himself as being gay, as this being his sexual orientation. That was not a concept people had. That is why it's so ridiculous when, for example, people claim, and that is something that is both claimed by fundamentalist believers who will then follow this, as well as by atheist attackers of religion who will claim that this is what religion says and therefore it is evil. It is ridiculous when people claim that, for example, the Bible or the Quran, they forbid homosexuality and that it's a sin in them. No, it's not. It can't be. Simply because there was no concept of homosexuality. You can't forbid something that you can't even think about. Like Jesus or Muhammad, they wouldn't have known what you're talking about if you talk to them about sexual orientation. This also, by the way, goes for other things. Like, for example, when it comes to Islam, you always have these fundamentalists who will claim that music is forbidden. Now, first of all, there's no verse in the Quran that you could possibly interpret in that way. Like when it comes to homosexuality being forbidden, there are one or two lines that you could read in that way if you really want to force it onto the text. But when it comes to music, there simply isn't such a thing. That is entirely based on some bullshit hadiths that those people believe in. But that aside, my main point is, certainly the Quran or some hadith can't forbid music, because once again, they didn't have a concept of music. It might surprise you, because just like with sex, we think that music is something that just exists, right? It exists in the world, everyone knows about it, everyone does it. So we think that everyone, every culture, every people that ever was, probably since the Stone Age, they all must have had a concept of music, like they all must have had a concept of sex, right? But the thing is, it only seems so obvious, so true for us that music or sex really is a thing, because, and here the idealism of Kant comes into play again, um, because we don't just passively take in the world as it is, but rather the world appears to us the way we choose, not consciously choose, but still choose to look at it. We don't just neutrally take in the world and then apply words to it to describe it, but rather we look at the world through the lens of certain concepts, and then the world appears to us in those concepts. So when it comes to music, of course, we nowadays will say certainly music exists in every culture. Certainly, even in the Stone Age, they were singing and drumming and whatever. And certainly that is true in that sense. But it is not a given to subsume so many different things like singing or playing the drum, playing the lute as music. That is a relatively new thing. Antiquity didn't know that. And at the end of antiquity and the start of the Middle Ages, when Muhammad lived, they still didn't know that. So you could not possibly forbid music as such. Maybe you could talk about certain things that we would now call music. Maybe you could say certain instruments are bad, certain songs are bad, certain instrumental play during dances that may incite sexual lust are bad. But you could not say music as such is bad, because music as such was not thought of. Concepts are rules. They are general representations, and it is not a given to find that such different things as singing, playing the drum, playing the lute, playing the piano, that despite their difference, they share some commonality. There is a general rule behind them. That is something you first have to think up. Or take something like the concept of childhood. Again, it seems so natural to us. I mean, children were always there, right? So everyone since the Stone Age must have had a concept of childhood. We think that all people must agree on some fundamental reality, and then just maybe disagree on how to deal with that reality. So every people ever had the concept of sex, then they just dealt with sex differently. Like they said, you can have sex before marriage, or you can't have sex before marriage. You can have sex with the opposite gender, or also with your own. But we do think that they all, first of all, had this concept of sex or this concept of music, but they didn't necessarily. And the same, for example, goes for the childhood. That also has been discovered in the second half of the last century by various historians, especially in France. We have this specific concept as children being very much distinct and their own thing, very distinct from grown-ups. and therefore needing certain care, needing their own spaces, their own toys, their own games, whatever. That was not so much a thing in the past, and it's a very recent thing. Like even a few centuries ago, in the time of the Reformation, you have people sending their maybe 7-year-old child out into the world to alone wander to some faraway city, become a student there, and that child would wander the countryside, maybe in groups of other children and youth, feed himself by begging, by stealing, maybe. You would have children going into a bar, into a tavern, playing dice with older people. You would have a 12 or 13-year-old as an officer leading soldiers in war. And today you may think, oh, what awful, irresponsible parents sending their 7-year-old child out into the world, not caring for their child. They must not love their child at all. But again, that is assuming your concept of childhood as something special, something needing special care, needing special protection. And if you just assume that they shared your concept of the childhood and then treated their child like that, then of course they were terrible parents not loving their child. But if you assume that they simply had a completely different concept of what childhood is, then their actions make more sense. And once again, I urge you to apply Kant's critical method to not just dismiss something else that seems wrong, but to try to understand where other people are coming from. That doesn't mean justifying everything. That doesn't mean you can't still, in the end, disagree. But it is a little too easy to just say everyone else is stupid or evil. You must first understand what's the point that they are coming from. And it becomes very difficult for this very reason to even talk about the past, because we tend to always retro-project our concepts to make the past more modern than it was. And then, of course, the not modern parts seem all the more glaring and all the more contradictory. But we must try to understand the past on its own terms. Now, of course, if we do have our modern concepts, we will find them in the past. We can, of course, look at the ancient Greeks and say, oh, they had politics, they had religion, they had sports. But the fact of the matter is, they didn't have distinct words for those things necessarily, because they didn't necessarily have distinct concepts for those things. Like, we now may look at the Olympic Games and say, oh, that is sports. That is not religion, for example. But the fact of the matter is, it was sort of both, right? They were cultic games. They were understood as being part of the religion, as honoring the gods or whatever. And it is a long and difficult work that can take centuries or even millennia to become clear about a concept, or to distinguish a certain concept from another concept. And it is a very important work because it is a work that gives us freedom. We are free to choose how to deal with a concept once we have that concept. Once we have clear concepts of the world, we can choose to maybe reshape the world, to maybe deal with those concepts differently. Once we do know what sex is, we can talk about how to deal with sex. As long as we don't have that concept, that's difficult. For example, in the age of Aufklärung, in Kant's time, he and other Aufklärers would argue for the separation of church and state. Now, even then, even when they were able to argue about that, that doesn't mean that it was simply done. It was still a very long fight for decades or even centuries. I mean, it's a fight that still isn't done today. But at least they were able to argue for this. And they were only able to argue for it because, while in reality church and state were not separate yet, at least as concepts they already had been separated. Like, people were thinking different things when thinking of the church and thinking of the state. And that is exactly what enabled them to also think that maybe they should be separated. If you didn't even distinguish between them in concept, in thinking, then it would not be possible to even call for this separation. I mean, go back some millennia into more ancient times, you will find that the very concepts were not distinguished. The priesthood and the state bureaucracy were one. The king was considered a god, or was the high priest, if you look at ancient Egyptians or Mesopotamians or whatever. So in such a society, even the most critical thinker could not even have come up with the thought that state and church should be separate, because that simply wasn't a possible thought back then. No one would have understood what that even should mean. So that is why it is very important to work on our concepts, to cultivate our concepts. That is what makes us become more free, what allows us to then reflect on those concepts and how we should deal with the things that they represent. And if it was possible in the past to, for example, separate the concept of the church from the concept of the state, there's no reason why it shouldn't also be possible to separate and distinguish between other concepts. Which is exactly what I try to do. I hope that there will be a future when, just like nowadays, we don't put sports and religion or the state and religion together anymore. We also won't put cult and religion together. That is something that Kant or other aufklärers like Fichte already talked about. Religion as a posture, as something inside your heart, as a connection with God, and acting in a godly manner, acting out not your own will but God's will, has nothing to do per se with cult practice, with praying, with going to the church or the mosque or the synagogue or the temple, with fasting, with going on pilgrimage and so on. But in the minds of most people, even though even 200 years ago philosophers distinguished between them, those things are still very much connected, even in the minds of scholars of religion. I hear scholars of religion arguing that, for example, Japanese society, despite being mainly atheist, is still very much a religious society. And they argue this because many Japanese people still practice their old Shinto rituals. They will still pray at the Shinto temples or light a candle there before they have an exam or job interview or whatever. But if they had more clear concepts about what religion is, they would realize that doesn't mean that the Japanese society is a religious society. It is still very much a cultist society. And just like that, I try, for example, to distinguish the concept of Aufklärung from the concept of Ausklärung. So the real Aufklärung from the enlightenment, so to say, from the entwilightment, from the half Aufklärung that takes itself to be the real thing. And most people, including all the professors that deal with philosophy, including the historians that write about the age of Aufklärung, have no concept at all of them being separate things, which makes basically all of their judgments about Aufklärung very confused and very incorrect judgments. But there's no reason why in some further future, in future centuries, it shouldn't be possible for us to as clearly distinguish these things as we now distinguish between other things. Kant knew how important it is to have clear concepts. He also knew what work it is to come up with new concepts. Not new words, but new concepts that then, of course, may need new words also. I would say that it is the most difficult kind of invention possible, the one needing the most genius. I mean, other sorts of inventions and inventing a new machine or whatever, they are based on concepts. When you invent a new machine, you already have certain concepts that you now apply to build that machine. But really coming up with a new concept, that is the greatest work, the greatest invention possible. And you have whole centuries having to work to create certain concepts that now are in everyday usage. And you have certain great thinkers, great philosophers, who in all of their philosophy and all of their writing maybe brought one new concept. Kant likes to say that when there is a very poetic form of speaking, like many in his day admired in the Oriental manner of speaking and writing, or in the old biblical manner of speaking and writing, this poetic, flowery, image-rich language, Kant says, really just betrays a lack of clear concepts. That is why he says humans start out like that, while the oldest forms of wisdom were expressed in poetry, in mythology, like in Hesiod or in the Orphic traditions. But then Kant very much believes in what is now, not in his time, but nowadays called the movement that the ancient Greeks had from mythos to logos. And he believes that that is what created the ancient Greek philosophy. And he very much considers that a progress in comparison to other wisdom traditions. He's not denying that there is certain wisdom in mythology or in flowery poetry, but to understand that wisdom, when you interpret those myths, you need to translate the image into clear concepts. And once you have the clear concepts, you don't need the images anymore. Surely, Kant says, they may aesthetically be more perfect, but logically, clear, distinct concepts are more perfect. And that is what philosophy, what science should strive for. And that is also what Aufklärung should be about. Clarity. Not vague poetry, not vague mythological images or such. And coming to such concepts very much is hard work. Kant applauds philosophers who, like ancient philosophers like Aristotle, who created such new concepts. You should realize that many concepts that nowadays are commonplace and used in everyday language, and that we don't think about much, they are often very, very recent. I mean, sometimes they are really recent, like only maybe 100 years or so. For example, take the many concepts that psychoanalysis brought us. Now, everyone talks about things being unconscious. I mean, people will often say subconscious, but that is just wrong. And Freud already fought against that word, saying we shouldn't imply that it is subconscious as if it was somehow beneath our consciousness, like in the lower part of the brain. It is simply unconscious, it is not conscious. Whenever someone says subconscious, you know that they are just repeating words they hear, but that they have not read actual psychoanalysis, because it's called unconscious. And of course, Freud didn't come up with that word himself. It already was used sometimes before in the 19th century. But still, it's a very new thing to talk about things being unconscious. But that's not the only thing. Even if you go further back to concepts that ancient Roman or Greek philosophers came up with, in the grand scheme of things, that's very recent. I mean, you have to realize that it's been about 11,000 years that we had civilization and agriculture. And even that is a short time if you compare it with for how long human beings lived before that. And only like 2000 or 2500 years ago, many of our concepts that we now use every day didn't exist as such. Like Kant says, it was a great accomplishment of the Latin writers like Cicero or so, to come up with concepts like reality. Nowadays, it's natural to speak about reality. Everyone knows what reality is, but really, it's not so simple. You first had to come up with that. I mean, res means sing in Latin, so reality is literally the singness, yeah, or the concept of quality or quantity, or Kant says the concept of possibility, like posse means can, being able to in Latin, and someone had first to come up with the concept that things don't just exist or don't exist, but also things that don't exist can possibly exist, and to call it possibilitas. So being able to be able, so to say, or being able to can. That was work that required real work of thinking to bring about those concepts. Kant also believes that this is a strength of especially the German and the Greek language, that they are especially suited for philosophy, because he says, and by the way, this is a judgment that other philosophers like Fichte or like Heidegger shared, but Kant, the reason he gives is that he says German has many concepts. It has a lot of words that are sort of synonymous, but not quite, because Kant believes there are barely any true synonyms in language. For the most part, there are always some small nuances, some small differences, and he believes that we should very much use those differences. In his writings, especially outside of his three critiques, like if you look at his anthropology or so, he sometimes goes on for pages defining various words, and he likes making small distinctions between various different words that for most people could be used interchangeably. Like, I can't give so many examples here because I'm not speaking in German. But like I said earlier, courage or bravery are not the same thing. You can distinguish different meanings between them. And to Kant, it was very important to use each word correctly and to not confuse them, because those differences in the words allow us very nuanced, very differentiated thinking, different concepts. And once again, that is why I very much want to call for being mindful and being responsible about one's language. Um, the thing is, the average everyday person, they can of course get by with a few hundred or few thousand words that they use mindlessly, that they use vaguely the same as they have taken them from the people around them who use them vaguely the same way. I mean, that's enough to in the morning buy your coffee from someone, and then in the evening complain about the elites or the immigrants or whatever. But if you want to be aufklärt, if you actually want to think and understand the world, you need to cultivate your intellect. You need to cultivate your concepts, the rules, the general representations that your intellect is thinking and through which your intellect is understanding, is literally grasping the world. My deep thanks be to my supporters, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pei, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.